Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. For today's video, we're going to be doing a reading wrap-up of the books I read in March, April, and then one book from May. It's been a while since I've done a reading wrap-up, but I finally have enough books to accumulate for today's video. There's basically three main categories, but one of them I'm going to kind of glance over because I actually have a separate video of all the books I read from that genre that I will probably have put up before now. So those three genres are books inspired by Crimson Peak, fantasy, and Iliad retellings, which is kind of like a very niche assortment of genres. But with that intro out of the way, let's get into the video. First, I'm going to talk really quickly about the three Crimson Peak inspired books that I read. The first one was Lakesedge by Linda Clipstone. I gave this a 4.5. I really liked it. I think it's not for everyone. It's kind of like a guilty pleasure. I also didn't really enjoy the first, say, third of the book. But after that, I really liked where the story went, and I liked the characters a lot, and I'm very much anticipating for the second half of the duology to come out in October. The next book I read was Gallant by V. Schwab. This book I gave a 2.5. It was very take it or leave it for me. I think this book was a disappointment to a lot of booktubers, both like seasoned V. Schwab fans and people that were coming in like completely blind to her work. A lot of people have said that this is more of like a lower YA or middle grade as opposed to a true YA. That necessarily wasn't what bothered me. I just felt that the book was kind of boring and I didn't really like any of the characters. And the last book that was Crimson Peak inspired was The Death of Jane Lawrence by Caitlin Sterling. And this book I gave 3 stars. The second half I didn't dislike because of the magic that was introduced. It was more so that I didn't really understand how the magic worked, and I just felt like the character arc wasn't fully fleshed out. Next set of books I'm going to be talking about are the fantasy genre books, and these 3 were all ones I had put on my March TBR. And I think I read them between March and April. The first one on this list, which is probably the lowest rated, is The Shadows Between Us. This book ends up giving 3 stars. I think the big thing is that it was just really boring. You get from the first chapter that it's going to have a lot of things that are going to happen. It's going to be really dramatic, but then nothing really does. I think another thing is that I just really disliked both the love interest and the main character. And for romance, if you don't like the 2 main people in the romance, it's not going to go very well. This is kind of an aside, but there was a lot of descriptions of clothing, and I think this was supposed to serve the plot because the main character is supposed to be like a trendsetter, and one of her friends is supposed to be like kind of copying her fashion, so there's supposed to be a little bit of characterization there. But I felt that it was very detailed and it really didn't need to be. This book felt very fluffy and self-fulfilling, and honestly, even though I said not particularly kind things about it, I feel like at the same time, more power to you. The opening, I think, what's it called, like an epigraph, was a line from a Vampire Diaries episode, and honestly that should have been like my first clue that this is supposed to be just fun and lighthearted and not taken too seriously. It's pretty inoffensive and living in its own fantasy world. It's just not exactly what was sold to me in the plot synopsis. The next book we are going to be talking about is The Helm of Midnight by Marina Lusteller. This is an adult fantasy novel that is the start of, I think, a 3-part series. The summary of this book is that it's about a mask that contains a spirit of a serial killer. It ends up getting stolen, and basically a magical police procedural follows as they try to track down who is behind it before they use the mask to recreate the same murders that the serial killer did. Essentially, there's 3 main stories. One is following Kronya, who is the main character, and she's basically like a fantasy cop, special forces type of character, who is trying to find the people that are committing the murders. There's also Melanie, who is like a simple girl from the countryside who gets wrapped up in this big conspiracy. And then there's also flashbacks to Louis, the serial killer, 10 years ago when he first started his killings. Kronya as the main character is the one that we spend the most time on, but I felt like her story was like the most boring by far. I think it's mostly like because she's very like steely and kind of like hid her emotions away, whereas Melanie like has like every single emotion as she has a really roller coaster storyline. And Louis is interesting because his is the most like background plot oriented, but I still also wanted to see more of his story too. I like the romances in this book because I latch onto ships, what can I say? Melanie and Leewood were really cute together, and their relationship felt very natural because they like went through this traumatic experience together and then became bonded and kind of have to figure out how to continue this life together. Kronya and Tybalt, I was like, it's going to be a very slow burn, and it's definitely one of the main things that's making me interested in continuing the series. Her scenes with him are definitely my favorites, so I'm excited to see how their relationship progresses in future books. The body horror in this book with Louis' killings was also so good. I honestly would have liked to see more of them, and because they were just so interesting, which is really saying something considering I really hate gore. I feel like it's been a long time since I've read a book where the next in the series isn't out yet, so I didn't have like easy access to continue on. There are a couple plot things in this book that just kind of left me wanting more, and I don't know if that's because it just wasn't like really clearly presented in this first book and we're supposed to expect more to be more fleshed out in the following books. I only gave this 3.5 stars, but I still think I will read the future books, and probably after the next one I'll decide if I want to go ahead and buy physical copies of them. And I probably said this before in my original TBR, but the cover design of this is just so incredibly stunning. It was definitely the thing that made me first interested in this book when I was just like looking through Goodreads. And the last fantasy book that we are going to be talking about is A Dark and Hollow Star by Ashley Shuttleworth. This book is about 4 queer teens, a ex-Fury, a half-fae, half-human, and a fae prince and his royal bodyguard. And they're trying to solve a series of murders of other half-fae, half-human people. That's what the summary is pitched as, but the squad doesn't really get together until the last third of the book. The beginning is more about setting up the world and kind of like how the dynamics of the courts work and what type of creatures we're going to see in the series. And oh my god, there are so many things going on. I feel like I need a family tree, especially for Arlo's family, because there's just like so many people, and I feel like I'm going to need that to be able to keep track of how everyone is like related to each other and why they're so relevant. In some ways, I felt like there was like too much, like maybe what I would consider even like pointless detail for how expansive the Fae world is. But at the same time, there were some things that just weren't really clarified. I will say once I got to the ending of the book and I read the epilogue and saw sort of what the overarching plot was going to be and also who the main villain of the series was, I feel like that kept me a lot more grounded and now I know what to expect from the next book. And also what I should focus on as like important details and what is just fluff. Another thing is I don't really see Arlo and Nausicaa's relationship yet. I feel like it just kind of came out of nowhere and is a little forced. I think that's partially because they don't have a lot of slower scenes together because for the majority of the book, Nausicaa is on the run. And Arlo isn't sure if she can trust her yet, but I think going forward, since they're on the same side now, in the next book there will be a lot more kind of like character relationship building. I ended up giving this book 4 stars, and I did pre-order the next one that's coming out, and I'll probably continue on with this series indefinitely until it ends because I do like what I've got so far. The next book I read was The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. This book I gave 4.5 stars and I really loved it. This is a Iliad retelling set from the point of view of Briseis, who is the slave and lover of Achilles. This book was really good. I loved the audiobook so much. It's very realistic and with a kind of like really brutal take on warfare and what it was like to be a woman in ancient times. Specifically being like a female slave, being like treated as less than human, as just like a prize to be won and traded among men. It's hard to really quantify and like talk about what I liked about this book. It was just so incredibly well written and I really enjoyed it. Also kind of an aside, but I love that Patroclus is like the golden boy in like both of the Iliad retellings I read, which I guess always works because he's supposed to be such a foil to Achilles. There is a sequel to this book called The Women of Troy, which focuses on the relationships of all of the characters right after the end of the Trojan War. And I think it came out either late last year or early this year, and I definitely will be picking that up soon. And the last book we are going to be talking about is the only 5-star read that I have read recently, and that is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This is another Iliad retelling that tells the story from the perspective of Patroclus, going from his childhood through the end of his life alongside the Greek hero Achilles. This book absolutely lives up to the hype. It's beautifully written. It has a lot of like quotes that made me stop at when I was listening to the audiobook and be like, okay, I definitely need to get a physical copy so I can go back and annotate this. Which is what I did. I went to my local bookstore and bought this probably when I was like 60% through the audiobook. I think the story really benefits from seeing Patroclus before and after he meets Achilles. So we as the reader can see Achilles through Patroclus's eyes and why he fell in love with him. Their dynamic is really the heart of the book, and it's really great to see them at every stage of their lives. And the relationship between Patroclus and Achilles is just so beautiful and heart-wrenching. I really just love their kind of like unspoken bond and the way that they can understand each other when no one else can. Going back to the writing, I saw a YouTube comment that said there's a lot of interesting kind of like repetition of certain lines used at different times. One that I noticed that kind of like drives me a little bit insane is Patroclus saying, and this, and this, and this, which shows that when he's with Achilles, he can kind of be bold and opinionated and speak his mind, when he's normally super shy and reserved, and that Achilles kind of like brings out the best in him. This is definitely what I would consider like a modern classic. I could see a lot of the messages that are in the Iliad on full display here, and I could see this be like taught in schools, if that makes any sense. I'm pretty sure at this point there's probably college classes that have this book as part of like required reading. Also kind of random, but I found out that Madeline Miller either is from Philly or currently lives in Philly, and I do have a little bit of hometown pride there. Anyway, those are all the books that I have been reading lately. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Consider liking this video or subscribing if you aren't already. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!